Hey guys, welcome back to the shop. Today I need to forge 4 knives as part of normal production around here at Fire Creek Forge. I'm going to be using the 3 3/4 pound hammer that I forged in the last video, as well as the 50-pound Little Giant. Today I'm working with 1/4 inch thick stock, and I'm working with a new preform idea that I've tried a few times, and so far I like the idea. This is just a groove or notch ground out with my small wheel attachment, and then of course when you're cutting your stock, it comes off at an angle there, and you're going to see how this is going to make forging a blade even quicker and simpler. And then of course I just got some blank stock here for a little bit different style of blade. So let's fire up the forge and get to forging. I'm going to start by forging the tangs on these full tang blades. That little divot that I ground out essentially acts as the beginning of the finger choil, or where the ricasso will start, and I can forge behind that to begin the tang. You can accomplish the same thing by using a round bar or some kind of top forging tool to create the same thing, but then you also have to forge it out flat and it just deforms the material. Different way of doing it. This is a little bit quicker. Once I've forged the tang narrower behind that finger choil area, I can stretch it out and forge in the contours of the handle. I also need to widen it a bit, and I do have enough stock to do that since this is 1/4 inch thick material. You kind of have to experiment a little bit to figure out how much stock you need to forge that tang out. Of course, I'm doing a tapered tang, and so you don't need, it's close to maybe half the total length of the handle in this case with the 1/4 inch stock. Of course, that's going to vary with thinner or thicker stock. I'm trying to widen the tang a little bit with the combination dies on my power hammer. That was not super successful. The drawing part of the die is not very rounded, so it still doesn't quite widen it. So I went to the anvil again with the rounding side of the hammer and spread that out on the next knife a little bit wider, a little bit more. Got them both looking pretty good. With the tangs completed, I'll move on to forging the blade. This is the edge side, obviously, and I'm starting the bevel here. This is where the plunge lines will be, where the grind or the bevel of the blade will start. It will be ground, of course. First, we're going to forge it in for the most part. I'm trying to get a feel for my hammer there, and it's I'm not landing quite square on stuff and bouncing off to the side a little bit there. I've got the bevel started, but before I go too far, I'm going to forge the tip in by bringing that steel up and around, and so the continuous grain of the steel will follow, the edge of the steel will follow the continuous grain, and where we cut the steel stock will be at the spine, at the back of the blade, at the tip there. Continuing forging the bevel, and you can see we've got a pretty curved blade shape now because of that. At this point, the spine is still a 1/4 inch thick, almost the entire length. I do want a distal taper on these blades, so using the Little Giant, just run down the spine of the blade and forge the thickness down gradually, and that also evens out the profile or the shape of the blade. Of course, this can be done by hand with the hammer. It's just quicker and a little less work to use the power hammer. Next, I'm going to clean up the profile a little bit. and stamp my maker's mark. Towards the end of my forging process, I'm working on finishing forging the bevel, straightening things up, and I'm using the press here to just press everything flat. It's not 100% helpful, I guess you could say, because this blade really has no flat or continuously flat spot on it. It's got a tapered tang and then a distal taper to the blade, but it does help in general with getting things straightened out in any little bends or kinks, and then I can refine things with the hammer as I need to. I want that edge to be in the center of the forged blade before I go into heat treat and then finally grinding. You'll notice some soapstone that I've rubbed on the edge of the knife here, and that really helps you see what you're doing with the edge to get it straight. Completing those blades, I'll move on to the next set of blades out of this piece of stock. These next two blades are hidden tang design or construction. So I'll start by forging the tangs on the little giant power hammer. I know not everybody likes to start with the tang, and there are some things you have to work around, but that's probably true of any particular method. I have been doing it this way for a while. It seems to work pretty decently if you want to do it this way. I need a tapered tang. It needs to be tapered in both directions, and of course that'll be refined a little bit on the grinder later, but you need to definitely have a tapered cross section to your tang in the forging process before you move on. Cleaning things up with the hammer, and then I can move on to forging in the tip. Now you'll notice the tongs I'm using, I'm choking right up on the tang, and the tang itself is not very hot. You'll also notice that I was forging in a nice set of fish lips there on the end of the steel, which is almost unavoidable in this case, but it's simple to fix. Simply grind off one side of the fish lips and then continue forging that steel up and around. So once again, the ground steel is at the top or the spine of the blade, and that original grain of the steel runs around through the entire edge, which is what you see me finishing here. So we have a pretty decent blade profile there, but there's no bevel on it and no distal taper, so we need to go back and narrow down the entire stock because it's going to get wider once we forge in the bevel. And I'm going to put a little bit of a counter bend in the blade. This is kind of tedious and not very easy to do in this particular way, but forging in the bevel is going to widen and curve the blade once again, and I want to equalize things as we go. I will be forging in a distal taper to this blade, and that will get most of the curve out and even things up, but I found just a slight counter bend down towards the ricasso seems to help. The near side of the bevel is easy to forge with the flat side of the hammer, and of course the far side is a little more difficult to get to. This differs depending on your right or left-handedness, but I found the rounding side of the hammer worked well for the far side of the bevel. Forging out the distal taper or the spine here, and you'll see how the blade is straightened out. I'm going to finish forging in my bevel, and that will get the blade profile very close to what I want it. Here I'm using the rounding side of the hammer, as I just mentioned. Let's look at the fruits of our labor here, but let me talk about how the hammer worked first. So, little lighter hammer that I'm used to working with. So I found myself actually extending my grip a little more to get a little more oomph out of it, which is to be expected, I suppose. And that's why I typically use this 5.5 pound, approximately 5.5 pound hammer, as opposed to this something like this 3 3/4. Now this is in the world of hammers, forging hammers, this is considered a large hammer. I don't necessarily recommend a super heavy hammer. If you can wield it without discomfort and stuff, that's great. But I mean, it's probably going to put a toll on your shoulder over the years. I don't know. I didn't exactly pick this profession to be comfortable and whatever. So this hammer's a little lighter, but it worked well. It did everything I expected a hammer to do. It's not my normal hammer, so it took me a few minutes to get kind of used to where I was hitting with it and everything like that, which is normal. That's what I've found. But absolutely no complaints. I really appreciate the rounding side here, and I can see where I needed to probably come back and redress this. I didn't get this completely domed here. It's not terrible, but it could be a little better. So I would do that before I sent this out to somebody, but I just made this for the shop here. But it's always nice to test your products out and use them. So anyway, that's the takeaway on the hammer. So talking about what we forged here, and again, this is 52-100 high carbon steel, so it does not forge nearly as easily as something like 1080 or 1095 that does not have that low alloy content. This has about 1.5% chromium, which does some great stuff for us, and it's got 1% carbon, so it's very good steel, but it is a little more difficult to work with in the forge. But this blade here that had the preform that I showed you guys, this is a deal that I've kind of been working on for a couple weeks. I just, I've got a few different knife models, and I'm trying to round that out more. I'm trying to go with some bigger knives like that Viking survival tool that you might have seen lately, and this is not it. But I didn't really have a forged medium size, sort of heavier all-around blade in the shop, and I had to get some 1/4 inch stock in because I was working with 3/16 and I just wasn't able to get the thickness that I wanted after forging it out. So I wanted a thickness of 3/16 or thereabouts, and that's kind of what we have here, a little heavier than that, and a nice distal taper and a tapered tang, so the thickest part is right through here, and that's turned out real nice. So this is just a great all-around wilderness belt knife, if you will. I mean, bushcraft, hunting, survival, all that stuff. It's heavy enough to do some heavier work, but it's going to be serviceable and useful for most things you're going to do. So not a super huge blade. About once I clean the profile up and everything, it'll probably be right around 5 inches, and that's a bigger knife in my book. But again, it's like a all-around belt knife that you should be able to field dress out a moose or a elk. This would be plenty big for that, and some people would consider it too big, and I might even too. But if you needed to cut through the joints or whatever without worrying too much about being super careful with some of these thinner, lighter blades, which you do, they slice and skin so nicely, but you can't just go to town on a joint. You have to be more careful, and these guys are a little heavier blades. You can take it and baton some kindling up for the campfire. So that's the point of these. These guys are going to be a Puko style or Scandinavian style. Use that term loosely, and these will be a great all-around blade size too. But forged these out of that blank stock, and they turned out nicely. So these the blade is close to the same size actually, and they'll be a very similar purpose to these, just a different design and a little more involved handle process, of course, with the hidden tang. It'll have a bolster and everything, so those will be nice. Distal taper here, again, some decent thickness to the spine here, so they're not just little tiny guys here. You don't have to worry about breaking these if you're actually using it for something a little bit heavier, you know what I mean? So Bevels are forged in, and I usually go a little thinner, honestly, on my bevels. This one's a little thinner. This is like 3/32 right here. This is a little closer to what I typically do. That's not too bad. That's about right. So there's a lot of talk about how thick to forge your bevels in. Obviously, you need to have enough steel left to grind it away to remove the decarburized steel that you're going to have. And that goes for the actual edge too. And so that's one thing I like about this method here. You see how the edge kind of drops down? I'm actually going to grind that back to about here, and that will ensure that I remove any decarburized steel from what's going to be the edge, and it will kind of clean up the overall profile of the knife as well. And so it looks like the edge drops down here, and it does, but it's not actually going to be even that pronounced on the finished blade, so it's going to be closer to the width of the ricasso. So that seems to be working pretty well. Those knives went into a normalizing cycle, which is the first thing I do after forging a blade. And then there's going to be a couple more processes. We have to harden the steel and then temper it. After all that's done, I can grind it, finish it, put a handle on it. And that's actually the step that I'm at, the stage that I'm at with these blades I forged a few days ago. They're all heat treated and ready to go. The only thing I have to do now is shape the handles on them. I won't bring you guys along for that today, but I do appreciate you coming along, seeing some of the stuff that I do in the shop here on a regular basis. And yeah, these are a couple of VSTs, Viking Survival Tools, and some more frontier-esque blades. So I'm going to go to the grinding booth with the appropriate accoutrements for personal protection from the dust, and do that for the rest of the day, get these finished up. So appreciate you guys watching, and we will see you on the next video.